Please welcome to stage, Mark King.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for being here. What a week. Wow. We needed this. So nice to see you all. It's rare that you get to come on stage and introduce somebody who's had an impact on your life that you thought you'd never meet. And that gets to be my job today. In 2007, I was sitting somewhere way back there. Family reunion 2007, and Gary Keller said these words. And he said that, Matt Green, remember, thank you, buddy. And he said, we're in for a rough ride. And literally, someone behind me said, yeah, I don't know about that. 3 years later, we were staving off bankruptcy. Just kidding. Many of us who are over-leveraged in our real estate portfolios were struggling with the market. You remember that, right? And turns out Gary was right. My MAPS coach led me to an author and a book, neither of which I'd ever heard of. The author's name was Sean Achor, and the book was Happiness Advantage. And in that book, what I learned at that time, studying positive psychology in the dregs of mindset around the real estate sector, was that we had been chasing these goalposts that kept moving away from us. And we thought more success and more money meant more happiness. And not only was that a misleading thought and idea, but it might just be contrary to what actually happened. So I jokingly told my wife I used to fall asleep with Sean Achor in my ear. When I told Sean that, he thought that was a little creepy. So I'm really happy to get to announce Sean today, and then his latest work, Big Potential, will make a lot of sense if you're studying Keller Williams right now. So Sean spent 12 years at Harvard, where he won over a dozen distinguished teaching awards. He delivered lectures on positive psychology in the most popular class at Harvard. Sean graduated magna cum laude from Harvard and earned his master's degree in Harvard Divinity School in Christian and Buddhist ethics. Sean has since become one of the world's most leading experts on the connection between happiness and success. Sean has now worked with over a third of the Fortune 100 companies in places like the NFL, the Pentagon, and the U.S. Treasury. To do his work, Sean has traveled to 51 countries speaking to farmers in Zimbabwe, CEOs in China, doctors in Dubai, and school children in South Africa. In 2014, Oprah Winfrey did a 2-hour interview with Sean on the science of happiness and meaning. His research on happiness made the cover of the Harvard Business Review. His TED Talk is one of the most popular of all time with over 16 million views. And his lecture airing on PBS has been seen by millions. Please welcome my friend and yours, Sean Achor.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. There are a lot of you. I told my 7-year-old son that I was going to speak here with this many people, and his jaw just dropped. I am...
Go back up just a little bit so you can get the introduction.
To announce Sean today, and then his latest work, Big Potential, will make a lot of sense if you're studying Keller Williams right now. So Sean spent 12 years at Harvard, where he won over a dozen distinguished teaching awards. He delivered lectures on positive psychology in the most popular class at Harvard. Sean graduated magna cum laude from Harvard and earned his master's degree in Harvard Divinity School in Christian and Buddhist ethics. Sean has since become one of the world's most leading experts on the connection between happiness and success. Sean has now worked with over a third of the Fortune 100 companies in places like the NFL, the Pentagon, and the U.S. Treasury. To do his work, Sean has traveled to 51 countries speaking to farmers in Zimbabwe, CEOs in China, doctors in Dubai, and school children in South Africa. In 2014, Oprah Winfrey did a 2-hour interview with Sean on the science of happiness and meaning. His research on happiness made the cover of the Harvard Business Review. His TED Talk is one of the most popular of all time with over 16 million views. And his lecture airing on PBS has been seen by millions. Please welcome my friend and yours, Sean Achor.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. There are a lot of you. I told my 7-year-old son that I was going to speak here with this many people, and his jaw just dropped. I am a little nervous, but so grateful for the opportunity to get to join you. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of your family reunion. I am excited because I think that the research that I've been doing for more than a decade just validates who you are. So today you're going to hear about how amazing you are, but you're also going to get to hear some research about how we could change the people who are not here in this room right now, how we can find greater levels of happiness and joy and meaning and purpose. And I want to go deeper with this group here today since we've got extra time and because I know you've been focused on this. So I just want to say how grateful I am that you're having me here. The other reason I'm grateful to be here is that when I first got into doing this research, actually when I first went off to college and started collecting educational debts, my father was buoyed by the idea that I would come back and I would be a doctor or a lawyer or a banker, something he thought would make a lot of sense. When I came home from college and told him, "Dad, I want to study the science of happiness," he sat me down. My father was a neuroscientist at Baylor University in Waco, Texas, and he told me, is that for Waco or for neuroscience? Either way, I'm happy. So yeah, he was a professor there in Waco, and he told me that the average scientific paper, the average scientific journal article is only read on average by 7 people total, which is incredibly depressing for a researcher to hear, especially because I know that that statistic also includes my mom. So now we're down to 6 people who read these studies, which is a travesty because what we've been learning about, I believe, literally transforms what it means to be human. And I can't wait to get to share this research with you. So if it's okay, what I'd love to do is I'd like to jump right into the research. I'd like to pull one story over from my TED Talk, and then we're going to deviate completely from there to talk about all the new research. But I need this one story to explain one of the pieces of research we just got back in. So I started all of this academic research when I was just 7 years old. So if any of you have children and they're 7 and they're not doing academic research, you're clearly not pushing them hard enough. But when I was 7 and my sister was 5 years old, I was 2 years older than my sister at the time, and we were playing up on these bunk beds. I'm 2 years older than her now, but at the time, that meant she had to do everything that I wanted to do, and I wanted to play war. So we're up on top of these bunk beds. How many of you had bunk beds growing up? Did anyone else have bunk beds growing up? I love them. I would still have them now if they were socially acceptable at all for a married guy. But on one side of the bunk bed, I had all of my G.I. Joe soldiers and weaponry lined up. And on my sister's side, she had all of her My Little Ponies and unicorns lined up for this cavalry charge. I wasn't too concerned about what was going to happen. I had won this war every single time we'd played in the past. And if I was losing, the rules of engagement would change. There are differing accounts of what happened that afternoon, but since my sister Amy was not invited to be part of your family reunion, you get to hear the true story. Which is my sister is a little bit on the clumsy side. And somehow, without any help or push from her loving older brother at all, suddenly Amy disappeared off of the top of the bunk bed and landed with this crash on the floor. I nervously peered over the side of the bed to see what had befallen my fallen sister, and I saw that she landed painfully on her hands and knees on all fours on the ground. I was nervous because my parents had charged me with making sure that Amy and I played as safely and as quietly as possible. And seeing as how I had accidentally broken Amy's arm 1 week before this, don't take her side, you don't know her. But I was trying as hard as I could to be on my best behavior, and I saw on my sister's face this wail of pain and suffering and surprise, threatening to erupt from her mouth and threatening to wake my parents from the long winter's nap for which they had just settled. So I did the only thing that my little frantic 7-year-old brain could think to do to avert this tragedy. And if you have children, you've seen this hundreds of times before. I said, Amy, wait, please, 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 please don't cry. Did you see how you landed? No human lands on all fours like that. She stopped mid-cry with confusion on her face and looked up at me, and I had no idea where else that was going. That was the extent of the strategy. So I blurted out the only other thing I could think of, which is, Amy, I think this means you're a unicorn. Which was cheating. Literally nothing in the world. Amy would have wanted more in that moment to not be Amy, the hurt 5-year-old little sister, but Amy, the special unicorn. Of course, an option open to her brain at no point in the past. And you could see on my poor, manipulated sister's face conflict as her brain attempted to devote resources to feeling the pain and suffering and surprise she'd experienced falling off of a bunk bed or contemplating this newfound identity as a unicorn on the other side. And the latter won out. Instead of crying, instead of ceasing our play, instead of waking my parents with all the negative consequences that would have ensued for both of us, instead, a smile spread across her face and she bounded right back up onto the bunk bed with all the grace of a baby unicorn with one broken leg. What we had stumbled across at that tender age of 5 and 7, we had no idea at the time, was something that was going to be at the vanguard of a scientific revolution we're living through right now, that we're lucky enough to be living through right now. We're living through twin revolutions. We're living through a technological revolution that allows our friends to be streaming in, to be able to watch this virtually with us here today. But in the midst of that technological revolution, we're also going through a human revolution we haven't processed yet. Given everything that's been going on, that human revolution is based in part on that technology. For example, we've been philosophizing about what leads us to greater levels of happiness and meaning for literally thousands of years. And for the first time in human history, we also now have additional tools like neuroimaging, which means we're starting to peer behind the curtain to see what your brain is doing as you're architecting a picture of your reality. And here's what we found. Your brains are amazing. I know many of you are like, I knew that, but your brain is phenomenal. Your brain is processing about 40 bits of information consciously every second, which is blazing fast. The only problem is your brain is receiving around 11 to 14 million pieces of information every second you're sitting here, which means as we look at the world around us, as we try and find happiness in this world, it turns out your brain is not processing our world. Your brain is incapable of that. Your brain can only process a few snowflakes in the midst of an absolute blizzard, which means if we're continually scanning first for the negatives, the hassles, the complaints, the frustrations, the threats, and the symptoms that are omnipresent throughout all of human history, and maybe you know people that are like that, they could walk into any house, any room, any business, anywhere in the world, even on vacation, and they can find something to complain about. Their brains are not bad. Their brains are experts at scanning the world for the threats first. The problem is once we got neuroimaging, we can see that as you do that, your brain actually has no resources even left over to scan for the things we're grateful for, or the meaning involved with our relationships, or the ways we could transform this reality into a better reality for all of us. And what we don't process, we miss. Whatever we attend to first becomes our reality, which is exactly what we saw with my sister Amy. So what I would love to do here today, because it sounds as if scientifically this is an easy problem. We just take resources from the negative and throw them at the positive. What I'd like to talk about here is so much deeper. I would like to go deeper with this group because they told me that you've been focused on these ideas, and this has been validated in your culture, and that Gary's been talking about this, and that Mark lives this. Part of what I'd like to do is to give basically the graduate version of this course. And what I would like to invite you to do, if you want to, I know having given this talk in various forms, if you just listen to it today, you'll remember maybe one or two things that you can't wait to share with somebody else. But if you open up a notepad function or if you have a piece of paper, those people who do that, they walk away with like 15 to 20 things they cannot wait to tell other people about. So if you want to magnify how much you get out of the session, we're going to go fast. There's going to be a fire hose of resources for you. If you have a notepad function or a piece of paper, write some of this down in short form so you can remember it after our brief time here together at the family reunion. So here's what I'd like to go deeper on, if you allow me to. Before we talk about happiness and success, what I'd like to talk about is something that's so fundamental to the way that we look at the world that this, I hope, will change the conversations we have with our children and every single person this room meets, which is magnified given the connections you have within this world. So from high school on, we teach people you are your genes and your environment. Genes plus environment predict your potential, right? So that predicted whether or not you join us here today. Genes plus environment predict our science about who's going to be successful here in this room. Which of your kids will get an athletic or academic scholarship? We're told genes plus environment predict everything. Here's the problem, though. The genes that predisposed you to your intelligence, to your creativity, to your athleticism, to your obesity, or your depression, and the environment around us, it turns out we're actually victims of both. No one who's joining us for the family reunion got to pick their parents. So the genes are outside of your control. And as we've seen so clearly together over the past 2 years, not only can we not control the macro environment, look how much we're struggling to control the micro environment. And in the midst of that, what happens to the world, and I believe you've seen it in your families, is we start to believe that happiness is outside of my control. The genes are outside of my control, and the environment I can't seem to change, so we have to wait for the world to change. Happiness is something that happens to you. If you'll allow me to, what I would love to do with you here today is to geek out for about 1 minute about what positive psychology is, because I think that this transforms the conversation and validates who you are. In science, we care about the average. We want to find out how many pills the average person should take if they get a headache while on their 30th Zoom call of the day. That's how we do dosing. But as soon as we start asking questions about human potential, which is what we're asking why you even came here today, as soon as we ask questions like that, if we do the same scientific method we've been using for decades, we create the cult of the average. If I ask a question like, how fast can a child learn how to read? Science changes the answer to, how fast does the average child learn how to read? Then we tailor the class right towards the average, forgetting the fact that many of us read much slower than the average or much faster than the average. If you fall below average, that's when psychologists get involved, because that means you have depression or disorder, and our goal is how do we move you back up to being normal again? But normal is statistically average. What I argue, what positive psychology argues, is that if we study what's average, we will remain merely average in our companies, in our schools, worldwide. Instead, we do what we're not supposed to do. If you've been in an economics course or statistics course, one of the very first things we teach people is how do we delete the outliers from the data? How do we eliminate the weirdos who are messing up my average? Now, I know, having come in and watching you guys at the hotel, I'm joined by a lot of weirdos here today. I've been following what's been going on with the conference on social media. There are a lot of weirdos here today, which means I would just want to study you. Mark is one of those weirdos. Gary was one of those weirdos. What we're finding in the midst of this is that when we study the weirdos, what we were doing was we were trying to figure out why they were different. Why is it that some children that grow up in poverty, where all of their peers' academic scores are depressed, theirs are going up? We study them. Why is it that someone who goes through a childhood trauma grows up to be incredibly successful? We study them. Why is it that someone who is in the midst of a hospital, in the midst of a global pandemic, where all the rates of burnout are skyrocketing, but theirs are dropping? We study them. What we were able to do by studying the outliers is we were able to learn what they were doing, and what they did when the world didn't look like it should, they did one of 5 things. They added in a positive habit. They deepened their social bonds. They scanned for more things that they were grateful for. They looked for meaning in their work, and they scanned for meaning in the midst of stress. If they did one of those 5 things, the weirdos or the outliers do something incredible. They break the tyranny of genes and environment over the trajectory of their levels of happiness. And when that occurs, that led to all the research that I was doing for 12 years at Harvard. When your brain becomes more positive than your genes and your environment, every single business and educational outcome we know how to test for starts to rise dramatically, and many of our health outcomes as well. Which means two things, and why I wanted to front load our whole conversation with this. On the one hand, if we're not just our genes and our environment, then change might be radically possible. Much more possible than we think is possible in our families. Much more possible than we think could happen out of a short talk, right? This is one of the things that I'd love for you to think about post this session. If we're not just our genes and our environment, that means that our conscious changes to our mindset and behavior dramatically impact the way that we view the world. But also, the second part is that the greatest advantage in the modern economy is a positive and engaged brain, which it turns out, if the first part is true, marrying them together, what we just learned is the greatest advantage in the modern economy is not something that the lucky inherit by having the richest parents or living in the best environments. This is something we could cultivate, train, educate, parent, and lead with. And I got hooked. I've been doing this in 50 countries for almost 2 decades. And I thought when I got into happiness research, I thought I'd be surrounded by ponies and unicorns all the time, that there'd be balloons everywhere, I'd be at Disney like every day. And instead, we found ourselves in some of the hardest places in the world. So if you've been going through difficult times, my hope is that this research actually is magnified in its importance. And my hope is that it's not just for you here in this room, this is for everyone who's outside of this room, because of something very important, which I'd love to show you right now. I've been so looking forward to this talk with you here today, because what I would love to do with an audience this size is I'd like to do one of the largest positive psychology experiments we've ever done in the world with you here today, if you're willing to participate. You don't have to, okay, one person is. You're in. Turns out, here's what we found. You don't have to do any of my experiments here today. I'm not allowed to bring consent forms to talks anymore after the electric shock problem we had the first time. If you're willing to participate, all I need you to do is to please partner up with one person that's sitting next to you. Partner up into pairs. But before you do that, I'm legally required to tell you that you cannot partner up with someone you're married to for this experiment, or that you wish you were married to. So move around if that's a problem for you. So partner up with somebody you're currently not married to and introduce yourself.
This is a fun experiment that we guys. Anna.
Does everyone have a partner of non-marriageable material? So here's what I need you to do. Some of you are struggling to find somebody you don't want to marry. Here's what I'd love for you to do. The people watching virtually, sometimes this one's more fun to watch. So you're going to enjoy this as the cameras will be pointed at them for part of this. So for those of you here in this room, the person that's sitting closest to that wall over here, you're person number 1 in the pair. Some of you are like, I already knew I was person number 1 in this pair. The person furthest from that wall, you're person number 2 in the pair. There should be a 1 and a 2 in each group. If you're front to back, if you went to somebody behind you, then the person closest to me is person number 1. If neither of those apply, you can pick one person to be number 1. So raise your hand if you're person number 1 for this experiment. Raise your hand if you're person number 2. Okay. That's not the experiment. I have to do this now because I did this experiment on Wall Street before the pandemic, and it literally took that struggling bank 5 minutes to figure out who number one in the group was, which explains what's going on there. So here's what I'd love for you to do. How many of you are psychology friends? You have a psychology degree, or you read a lot of psychology books, or you love to raise your hand? Many of you. So for my psychology friends, this is the emotional prime of the experiment. And for everyone else, this is nothing. Over the course of your life, you've taken your genes, your genetic predispositions, and you've built those genes up through your self-discipline and your self-control. You passed the classes you needed to in school to get into the jobs you want to apply yourself to your work. You're so successful, you're here. What I'd love for you to do is to use all that self-discipline and control that you've been cultivating for decades, and I'd like you to use it to control your behavior for just 7 seconds with your partner if you can. At 8 seconds, you can do whatever you like to or with your partner, but for 7 seconds, we need you to control yourself. So person number one, what we ask you to do in this experiment, is to not get angry with person number two when they do to you what I'm about to tell them to do to you. I'm so nervous, my water was shaking up here. It looked like the water in Jurassic Park. So here's what I'd love for you to do. Like 2 people got that. So, so person number one, don't get angry, don't get sad. Please, please don't cry like the group a couple weeks ago. That was so embarrassing. That was at the Pentagon. So I basically need you to do nothing with your partner. So person number 1 and 2, please turn and face one another. Person number 1, make sure you're within striking distance of person number 2. And person number 1, just go neutral on the inside. Try to feel no emotions and try and think no thoughts, which after last night for some of you is going to be very easy this morning. The person number 1, just go neutral on your face. Show 0 emotion on your face. Don't move your hands from this point in the experiment, person number 1, even to defend yourself from person number 2. And person number 1, just go neutral on your thoughts. Don't try to go not have any fear or angst or anything, any emotion on the inside. Go neutral on your face and your emotions and your hands. Once you're ready, person number 1, using your decades of self-discipline and control to control your thoughts, your emotions, and your hands and your face. Then person number 2, please look at them. Make sure you're looking at them directly in the eyes. And for the next 7 seconds, person number 2, please smile genuinely and warmly, but directly up into the eyes of person number 1 while looking at them as warmly and as deeply as possible. Ready? Go.
You're not supposed to smile. You guys do it?
Anybody that
And stop.
Oh my god. When we were there, it was so funny. That was so much fun.
I'm sorry. We're going to need to do that one more time. Person number 2, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize you were the one with all the power and control in this relationship. So let's just switch around. Now, my few psychology friends know you never repeat a psychology experiment with deception in it, but let's just try it. Person number 2, go neutral on the inside. Feel no emotions, think no thoughts, control your face with your decades of self-discipline and control. Person number 1, please look at them. Make sure you're looking at them directly in the eyes. And for the next 7 seconds, it's your turn for retaliation. Please smile genuinely and warmly directly into their eyes while looking at them warmly and deeply. Go.
Can't do it. It's so hard. It was like...
And stop.
It was so painful. That one, Mike. How did you do that?
I love that you guys were clapping, but I don't know why. That was terrible.
Yes.
Failure in this experiment. Failure meant you smiled when I asked you not to. Success meant that you did not smile for the full 7 seconds. Raise your hand if you failed miserably in this experiment by smiling when you were not supposed to be smiling here in the room. Look around the room. That's incredibly high and terrible. Raise your hand if you successfully did what I asked you to for the full 7 seconds. You did not smile. I don't have time to count all the liars, but here's what we found. I've done this experiment in 50 countries. 80 to 85% of people worldwide cannot control themselves for 7 seconds of this experiment. I've done this with senior level bankers, all men, all in their mid-50s in Tokyo, Japan during a banking crisis. And the smile percentage was in the mid-70s. Extraordinarily universal response. Now this experiment in this form is predictive of nothing, but it illustrates something that transforms what it means to be human. And we get so little research like that. There are small parts of your brain called mirror neurons that activate in reaction to the world around us. So if I see somebody yawn or I see somebody smile, those small little parts of my brain, those mirror neurons can light up. If you're smiling at me, small little parts of my brain, those mirror neurons can light up saying, I'm the one that's smiling. And I can, and then my face might start to contort into a smile before I can stop myself. Same thing is true with yawning. If you see someone yawn across the room, your mirror neurons can activate if you see them in your visual field, and you can pick up a fatigue response, even if you slept really well the night before. But where this gets fascinating is if you have 15 strangers waiting for a plane, they don't even know they're part of an experiment yet, they're just waiting at their gate for their plane. You introduce an undercover researcher to stand in the middle of the 15 people in a 5-meter radius, and the undercover researcher just begins to bounce nervously in place, tap his foot impatiently on the ground, and look at his watch repeatedly with a frown on his face. Within 2 minutes of waiting for that plane or train, depending on the study worldwide, on average, 7 to 12 of the 15 individuals unconsciously start to shift nervously in place and or tap their foot on the ground and or look at their watch more than 4 times in a 2-minute span of time. If you don't believe me, this is one of the experiments you all get to try out yourself the next time you get on a plane. If you want to spread stress and negativity to the people on your plane. Which is why I always do this experiment at a different gate than mine. But the reason I love this experiment is because it shows us that not only do smiles and yawns spread, but it turns out that negativity, stress, uncertainty, and anxiety, we can pick up like secondhand smoke. You don't have to be the one smoking to have the negative health implications. The same thing is true with how other people's brains in the midst of this world right now process your world. Now, as soon as I tell people that, I think they make a mistake. They immediately start thinking, well, then here are all the people I'm going to cut out of my life. I'm not going to hang out with that guy anymore. I'm going to defriend her on Facebook. I don't need to see these posts. When I get home from this conference, I'm not even going to look at this person, which is awkward because I'm married to them. If that's what we're doing is we're eliminating social connection. But social connection is the greatest predictor of our long-term levels of happiness. I think that there's a more powerful way that I want to describe here today in the midst of this research. As I mentioned, taking a few notes, if you had the inclination to do so, the things I would write down up to this point is one is those mirror neurons, or just mirror, so you can remember the mirror neuron experiment, to remember that it turns out that what's going on in other people's brains actually impacts your brains, but it could go both ways. Not only can we pick up on negativity like secondhand smoke, but it turns out optimism and happiness is equally, if not more, contagious if done the right way. Other things I would think about is the idea that we're not just our genes and our environment. If that's the case, that unlocks our potential more than many of the things we've actually been thinking about or dreaming about within our world. Because it's not just a small change to your life, it's a change to the trajectory of what happens next and how we can move onward together. So in order to talk about this, I wanted to talk about a couple of things. First of all, I mentioned that those mirror neurons allow us to not only absorb the negative, but we did an experiment where we picked up an idea that we learned from the Ritz-Carlton. The Ritz-Carlton hotel chain has a management tactic, and one of the things that they train their employees to do is something called the 10-5 rule. If you walk within 10 feet of an employee at the Ritz-Carlton, they're trained to make eye contact and smile at you. Within 5 feet, they're trained to say hello. It's actually really fun to go in and out of those spheres with them, even if you're not staying there. And what we did was we took that idea and we put it into a hospital system. Post-Hurricane Katrina, we went out to work with Ochsner Health Systems, and we trained all their employees and staff to do this simple 10-5-way experiment. Now, some of the doctors said, I'm not doing this stupid smiling initiative from HR. We said, you don't have to, this is an opt-in program. What happened was, as you videotape the hallways, the patients coming into the hospital never learn the 10-5 rule. They're not trained before they walk into that building. But as they walk into that building, their brains unconsciously learn the social script of how we're supposed to interact with one another. Just like if you're at a resort and people are waving and smiling at you, you find yourself waving and smiling at other people too. You pick up on that pattern. If you move into a new neighborhood where everyone waves and says hello, you start to do that as well. I talked to an executive from Google, and he said that he was in a neighborhood like that. He moved to a new place, and no one would make eye contact with him in his new neighborhood. So he just went on a campaign and started smiling and waving at everyone, and they would take wide bursts around him. But it turns out it slowly started to change the social script as new people started moving to the neighborhood and be like, oh, we're supposed to be like that guy, right? And they started to pick up. The same thing happened in the hospital hallways. We could videotape it, and patients walking into the hallway never learn the 10-5 rule, but they unconsciously pick up on the social script, and they start making eye contact and smiling at the stubborn doctors who weren't doing it in the first place. That would be a cute story about how some hallways could change in a hospital. The reason I'm telling you this is we wanted to quantify how that impacted the quality of care that the people received. We weren't allowed to go into the doctor's rooms. We were only allowed to be in the hallways because of insurance. So we just stayed in the hallways and did the weakest intervention we could think of, a 1-second behavioral change of making eye contact and smiling. And it turns out, when you compare that half of the hospital system that adopted the 10-5 rule to the other half, within a 6-week period of time, their engagement scores rose to the highest in a decade for the staff that was there. But the patient's perception of the quality of care skyrocketed in the midst of the challenges they were experiencing, which is phenomenal because we weren't in any of the rooms where care was being provided. And yet, a small change that was happening in a hallway was impacting how much they thought there was quality in the care that they were receiving. And what we started to realize was this wasn't just happening in hospitals, but what if we got more than 1 second with somebody? More than 1 second when you're showing them around or working with them or leading a family. What if you got more than 1 second with somebody at a dinner or at an event? Could we take somebody who's a genetic, low-level pessimist and help move them to a default optimistic state? That sounds like science fiction. We don't think that's even possible because we bought into the belief that we are our genes and our environment. But there's a path out of this. And that's what I want to describe based upon all this research. There's been so much research done. What I'd love to do is to give you some of the home run or the most exciting pieces of research that I think you can use as we move forward. I'm going to lump them into 2 categories, 2 mindset shifts that I think will change the way that we look at the world. And as Mark described, one of those mindset shifts was one of the ones that transformed his life. And we have a whole new piece of research that I get to share with you here today. Then I'll talk about the behavioral ones at the end. But to tip my hand, I think everyone thinks in my talk that the behavioral part, that's the takeaways. The takeaways are the mindset shifts. From mindset shifts come all the other changes. It changes the conversation you have with your kids or with your partner or spouse about what you're trying to do with your work and why you're trying to be successful and where we're going together. So the first one is wrapped around how we view the world and how we pursue happiness. So I grew up in Waco, Texas. I lived there for 18 years. This was Waco of the 80s and 90s. So this is before Chip and Joanna Gaines fixed it up. This is when dancing wasn't allowed on Baylor campus, which explains so much of my life. But it turns out when it came time for college, we didn't have money for college, which was fine. I was going to stay in Waco for free. I applied to Harvard on a dare, but I wasn't valedictorian. I didn't get perfect SAT scores. I was a volunteer firefighter back in Waco. I think they have one slot for a volunteer firefighter because they let me in, but we couldn't afford it. And then 3 weeks later, I got a Navy ROTC scholarship that paid for the whole thing. So suddenly, something wasn't even a possibility became a reality. Now, the only reason I'm sharing that biographical information with you here is it changed the research we're about to talk about. Because when I arrived in that environment, this was a place that was supposed to be a success. You get in, that's amazing. You're surrounded by opportunity and opulence. And I assumed anyone who went there would be so grateful, so happy every day that they were there, knowing that their life had been changed. When I graduated, I realized if I leave, they're probably not going to let me back in. So I just stayed. I graduated, and that June, I took my broken futon and my halogen lamp, and I moved right back into the first-year dorms and lived in the first-year dorms for the next 8 years of my life. My mom was so proud. Dating was a challenge. But it turns out, in the midst of this, they give you 30 first-year students, and your job is to counsel them during that first hyper-competitive year of being at college, away from your social support networks. Those of you who are parents who have kids in college right now know what I'm talking about. And what we found was, my job was to read their admissions files, do academic advising, live in the trenches with them, hear about their breakups, eat all their meals with them, watch whatever shows you need to get them together, watch Dawson's Creek or New Girl, whatever it is that could bond them together. And in the midst of this, we found that 80% of those students were going through depression. The last time this was public, 10% of the Harvard populace contemplated taking their life at some point during their 4 years of this environment. Now, those are statistics, but every one of them was someone's son or daughter. And it was heartbreaking watching people with so much potential sometimes lose connection to the very meaning in their lives. When I traveled to 50 countries, what I realized was this had nothing to do with Harvard. Nothing to do with privileged Ivy League students. This story had to do with how every single human brain in the world contemplates the connection between your previous life successes and how much happiness you think is possible today, given what you think is about to happen. When what we started to realize was that people followed a very simple formula. We all do this. If I work harder, we'll be more successful. And if I'm more successful, then I'll be happier. That's what got us here, right? We thought if I work hard, I'll get that degree, and then think how happy I'll be. Or when I get that job, think how happy I'll be. When I get that home, think how happy I'll be. When I get the sales number, think how happy I'll be, right? When I get married, think how happy I'll be. Remember that one? I'll be happy forever. But then you have kids, and you want them happy too, right? And then you start to realize that there's an issue. Back in the 50s, there was a series of studies done that we didn't need to do, but we do a lot of these studies to get published. And what they found was every time your brain has a success, your brain changes the goalpost of what success looks like up. That's it. You didn't need to know that based upon science, because otherwise, the very first time you took a step, or you caught a ball, or you put Legos together as a 4-year-old, you would have been done, right? If I ask you if you're successful today, be like, Sean, wildly. I put those Legos together when I was 4. We literally talk about this every time we meet up. The problem is, if you learn addition, we want to learn, can you learn subtraction? And then multiplication, division, calculus. Can you create a product? Can you lead a team? Can you hit your numbers? Can you build a business? Can you create a community? Can you create a family? We want those targets to keep rising. As you're here, setting those big, hairy, audacious goals for where you want to go, that is highly adaptive. At every conference I go to, at least in this a sales conference, they're setting those targets higher and higher and higher. We should be doing that. The problem is, those two mindsets that we hold in the midst of our work that are at every conference, those two mindsets are completely incompatible. On the one hand, we're saying happiness will exist when. My happiness will happen when I hit that success. So happiness is on the opposite side of success. At the same time, we're saying success is continually a moving target, which means we've just pushed happiness over the cognitive horizon. We never get there. This is one of the things that I hope you take away from this talk and bring back to someone else as a conversation about what we're doing with your work or how we create happiness for our children. Because when I realized this, I realized I really thought when I was in high school, if I got good grades, think how happy I'll be. But what happens if you get good grades? You need to go to a better school. You get to a good school, don't get excited yet, you don't even have a job. You get a job, you hit your target, we raise your targets. Or if you help 100 people, what if you could help 150 people? We want that target to keep rising. The question is, this room is extraordinarily successful. If you're joining us here today for the family reunion, based upon those credentials, should be 100% levels of happiness. Over the past 2 years, you're here. You've got your degrees or your job. You've got a family. You've got these things in your life that you thought would create happiness. And it didn't work, right? So then we start to think, got it. No connection between happiness and success. We know success doesn't yield the happiness we expect. I've had the opportunity to work with only a handful of A-list like movie stars and celebrities, and they crash and burn when they basically can't earn more money or fame, but it never created the happiness they thought, and they find themselves sequestered in their beautiful Hollywood homes, and they never felt the happiness they want to. And in those moments, they can either continue to crash and burn into depression, or they start to shift. And where they shift is what we've seen in positive psychology. Back in the 80s, there was a series of studies done on 4-year-olds. They got very excited about these spatial memory tests because they could give them to 4-year-olds, and what they found was, for half of the 4-year-olds, they would give them the neutral instructions. The other half, they gave them neutral instructions, and then before they did the test, they asked them to think of their happiest memory. It's a very weak emotional prime to get their brain primed towards positive. Now, the researchers say they're 4, so they say stuff like, I had Jell-O for lunch. That was my happiest memory ever. And you get those parents pounding on that mirror you can't see through, going, no, it was Disney. I spent $400 for your birthday. It was Disney. Whatever makes the child happy, not the parent, it turns out that in the positive condition, the children's spatial memory scores improved by 60%. Not 6%, 60%. In every replication of the study. But why? We were told happiness and spatial memory are separate parts of the human brain. Then, in 1998, they found if you prime doctors to become more positive, they're 19% faster and more accurate at coming up with the correct diagnosis, compared to their own brain in negative, neutral, or stressed, which is why we should be giving lollipops to the doctors instead of the other way around, right? This literally should have been healthcare industries transforming, but only 7 people read these studies, right? Then, at MetLife, amongst the insurance sales force, Dr. Martin Seligman from the University of Pennsylvania came in to measure the levels of optimism amongst salespeople, and then correlated it with their sales, and found something stunning. The top 10% of optimists were outselling the other 90% in aggregate by another 89%. That was so robust, they did a multi-million-dollar gamble. They hired people that were low on the industry standard test, but high on levels of optimism. They didn't tell them they were part of that special hiring force because that'd be a very awkward conversation, right? You're not that smart. But boy, are you happy, you're hired. By year 1, they outsold the normal hires by 26%. By year 2, is 57%. I know what many of you are thinking. You're thinking, well, of course, those optimists are happy. They're selling a ton. That's a causation problem. We don't know if sales was leading to happiness or happiness was leading to sales. That's where most thinking people stop, not knowing that we've answered the chicken or the egg question for happiness literally 2 decades ago. It's a very easy answer to look for, because what you do is you take a neutral sales force in terms of their levels of optimism, and then do the behavioral habits I will talk about at the end, to raise their levels of optimism on average to the top quartile, and then measure their sales 2 quarters later. And 2 quarters later, cross-industry, their sales rise by 37%. Now, that doesn't mean everyone's sales rise by 37%, because this is cross-product and cross-function, but what we've since learned is the greatest predictor of sales performance was actually your optimism, which most of us default to our genes with. But if we weren't just our genes and our environment, we could transform the trajectory of what happens next. To summarize in the next section, it's everything. Everything we tested for when the brain became more positive rose dramatically. When the brain became more positive than your genes and your environment, every single business outcome at Harvard Business School we've looked at, all of them rose dramatically. Your productivity at positive rises by 31% over your own brain at negative, neutral, or stress. You live longer, your symptoms become less acute, your social bonds deepen, you become more altruistic. Everything we test for on the ACT and SAT standardized test in the United States rises dramatically when the human brain is positive first. I have to tell you one study. I want to go, because I'm doing that in short form. All of that research initially was in the happiness advantage, and then we've been able to extend beyond that over the past 10 years working with organizations doing it. But I have to tell you about one a little bit more deeply, because I think that this is one of the takeaways you can take from this talk about how we change to achieve that happiness advantage. I went out to UBS, to the Swiss bankers, in the middle of the banking crisis and looked at how they were dealing with stress that they were experiencing in their industry, right? A stress that we've experienced over the past 2 years. So, past 5 years for many of us. And what we found in the midst of this is they were using basically a PowerPoint presentation as their stress management program. And I sat in the back of the room and the PowerPoint presentation went like this. Did you know that stress is related to the 10 leading causes of death and disease in the United States? Next slide. The World Health Organization found stress to be the #1 killer at work. Next slide. Stress is catabolic, tears down every organ in the body, including your skin. Next slide. So whatever you do at work, don't stress. You hear that information, what does it make you feel? Stressed. We created a fight or flight response to your fight or flight response. If you Google stress and then click on images, it's literally people's heads exploding. That is our conception of stress within the modern world. And yet I'm struggling to find any occupation that doesn't have stress and didn't have elevated stress over the past couple of years. There's great research proving that stress is debilitating. Out of the same labs, there's research that shows that for some people, it does the exact opposite. I'm not talking about eustress or good stress here, for those of you who know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about sales positions, fighter pilots, professional athletes, people who stress is part of their job, right? Being a parent. In the midst of these things, what we found was that for some of them, when they have stress, their immune system turns on to its highest possible level, which makes sense. If you're a gazelle and you're getting scratched by a lion, that's when you want your immune system at its highest level, not when you're sitting around eating grass or whatever gazelles eat, right? Or in the midst of, these people don't get sick when they have a ton of work. They actually get sick when they have time off. These are people, I work with the Marines out at Camp Pendleton under Colonel Rideout, 6 battalions of Marines out there. They don't onboard you with a beach vacation. They onboard you to their culture with boot camp, one of the most stressful situations possible, right? Because they know from centuries of practice, if you put people through stress with the right lens and with other people, they create meaningful narratives and social bonds. They talk about the rest of their life. Is it possible that the stress that we've experienced could not just be something that tears us apart, but post this session, as we move onward together, we could find a way of actually having it make us stronger together? Because that stress, when we realize we didn't overcome it alone, but with other people, transforms what happens. So why is it that some people thrive in the midst of stress and others don't? We thought it was genetic, but we decided to test it. Half of the managers, we told them stress is bad for you. Here's some tools in the midst of your work to decrease stress within your life. The other half, we told them stress is actually enhancing. Embedded within every stress is meaning. This is something I didn't realize until doing this study. If I tell you someone's failing math, you don't care. If I tell you we got an email while that happiness guy was talking, and it turns out your son is failing math, you feel stress. There's meaning involved with the relationship. If I tell you your inbox is overflowing with spam, no one feels stress. If it's overflowing with leads you need to get back to, people who are depending upon you, you feel stress because there's meaning involved with that relationship. So what we got people to do is something very simple. If you're writing anything down, we got them to acknowledge their stress and identify the meaning. That's it. So as a team or a family is trying to go through a stressful situation, we had them scan for why the stress was meaningful. It was a 1-hour intervention, right? If their stress is about their kid failing math, what they think about is not the fear of what happens to their kid when they fail math. What's guiding them is a reminder that they care because they love their son so much. So as they're dealing with this math issue, they're dealing it from love instead of fear. Sounds like a small change. I went in there with Peter Salovey, who's now the president of Yale, and Alia Crum out at Stanford. In an article we published in the top psychology journal, we found that 6 weeks later, when we measured these two groups, the stress levels for both skyrocketed. It didn't decrease their stress at all. Their stress kept going up. They're in the middle of a banking crisis, and now they're not getting paid. But for the group that saw and identified meaning involved with their stress, turns out the negative impacts of stress upon the body evaporated. A 23% drop in the negative health impacts of stress, headaches, backache, lower job effectiveness, and burnout evaporated from the same level of stress as the group that was fighting the stress. What that was an indication of, and this is maybe one of those things to write down, is stress is inevitable, but its effects are not. We will feel stress post-pandemic. We know that because we felt massive stress pre-pandemic. What we're finding in the midst of this is that when we identify the meaning, it transforms how the stress impacts us. The problem is we only hear one side of the research. We only hear the research that stress is bad for you, so we keep feeling stress is deteriorating when actually, when we identify meaning together, it transforms it. To summarize this whole section, here's what we found. Happiness is the greatest advantage in the modern economy. It literally turns on your brain to its highest possible level, not only improving our sales dramatically, but it raises every single business and educational outcome we know how to test for. Which means the formula might be flipped. Instead of thinking, I will feel happy when, which you'll catch yourself doing 4 times before you leave here today, right? I will feel happy when I get to that number. I'll be happy when I get home. I'll be happy when we're on vacation. I'll be happy when this change occurs within the political or economic environment. I'll feel happy when the dishes are done. When the dishes are done, they will fill back up again, and happiness will not naturally result. But what we found is if you flip it around, and right now, in the midst of a family reunion, if we find some way of raising our levels of gratitude, deepening our social bonds, which is why you came or joining virtually, we're finding ways of scanning for meaning involved with our stress. If we do one of those things, what happens next is every single business and educational outcome starts to rise dramatically, which is amazing. What we were learning was we weren't just one type of person. Change was radically possible, and what got us there was not success. What gets us there is a positive brain. Now, I think at this point in the talk, many people think, great. So I'm going to go buy a self-help book. I'm going to be really, I'll be really happy, and then I'll be a billionaire. And that's not where I'm going with this. I'm going somewhere slightly different. You can be a superstar. You just can't be a superstar alone. So 5 years ago, I started working with the Flint school districts. This is the public schools in Flint, Michigan. This is in the midst of cyclical poverty. This is in the midst of lead in their water with low test scores. And our goal was, how do we get the teachers to become happier so they'll stay for more than 2 years? When we did so, we only had money to work with the teachers, but it turns out the teachers, students, parents, or guardians' well-being scores started improving dramatically. But we weren't working with them. We were working 4 degrees separate from some of the individuals whose scores were improving. And what we started to realize was that there is a hidden ecosystem that we ignore when we pursue happiness within our world. So I wrote a book talking about how we could create an interconnected approach to happiness and success. How do we find some way of improving the ecosystem, which in turn creates this virtuous cycle back for us? So when you write a book, you get basically 1 week to get on a bestseller list, because all of your pre-orders count for that first week. So my wife was pregnant at the time, Michelle was pregnant, so we decided that we're going to have a baby at the end of April. let's have this book come out in February. I'll go for 1 week, and then I'll get off the road. So that's what I did. Well, that's what I was going to do. The day before the book came out was the Super Bowl. And during the Super Bowl, while my team was playing, during the first quarter, my wife's water broke. We didn't know that was what was going on at the time. I'm a researcher. I'm like, honey, should we go to 39 weeks or 40 weeks or 41 weeks? What would be best for our child long term? 2.5 months early, her water broke. Now, we didn't know that was what was going on at the time, and it was during the Super Bowl. So she Ubered to the hospital. Husband of the year. I got her an Uber XL, so that's fancy. She got there, and they said, ma'am, your water broke. You need to stay here for 6 weeks holding this baby in. 3 days later, our daughter was born. We almost lost her 3 times over the next 2-day period of time. She kept sparking back to life. We didn't have a name for her at the time. Her name is Zoe Sparks Acor, and she just celebrated her 4th birthday. She's amazing. Instead of going on a book tour for a week to talk about how happiness and success are interconnected and research on that, instead for this researcher, my happiness for the next 50 days sat in an incubator in NICU, being cared for by those angels who were keeping her alive when my success rate would have been 0 at keeping Zoe alive. And what we got to do is to battle test the research I want to share with you now. That book is called Big Potential. And if there was one thing I would want to share with the world in the midst of the global pandemic and the after effects, it was this, because I really wanted people to realize happiness is not an individual sport. That might be one of the things you want to write down. And if you're writing things down, write these 2 other things while you're there. Write Hill and Firefly. These 2 studies are my favorite 2 studies. I put them literally in the first 3 pages of Big Potential because I was so worried people wouldn't read more than 3 pages of my book. These stories are things you're going to want to share with other people. It's something you're going to want to email out to somebody. It's something you're going to want to tell your kids about. When you feel comfortable, it's something you're going to want to talk about at a dinner party and totally take credit for it. Be like, yeah, I was reading the study. The first one is the Hill study. They found these 2 researchers out in Virginia found if you look at a hill you need to climb in front of you, if you look at that hill by yourself, your brain will show you a picture of a hill. We knew that was going to happen. You can see a picture of me now, right? But what we found was that if you have the participant standing alone looking at the hill, the picture that their brain shows them in their visual cortex, that hill looks 20 to 30% steeper compared to if you just have one more participant looking at the hill that they're told is going to climb the hill with them. It takes a moment, I think, for this one to set in. It took me a while, but the inclusion of another brain looking at an obstacle transformed the geometry of the challenge you saw in front of you. That was one of those matrix moments for me because I thought I knew how the world worked. I thought seeing is believing. I see a hill. I know whether or not I can overcome that. That is not how human perception works at all. If we had more time, we'd talk about how these are the same researchers that found that when you're in a chronic pain state, if anyone else has experienced chronic pain, hospital hallways look longer in a pain state than in a non-pain state. Your brain expands the hallway in your mind so that you won't walk down it to protect you. Same thing happens if you're looking at an obstacle alone. Your brain's trying to protect you. It's saying, don't do it alone. As soon as you have somebody else, that hill drops. We thought it was the physical ones. The emotional ones are even bigger. Overcoming depression and anxiety in the midst of a virtual world while trying to build your business, while sometimes having your kids at home in the midst of a global pandemic with all the political and economic uncertainty, as we're on social media and the news, those hills in front of us about whether or not somebody thinks that they could buy an apartment or a home, or whether or not they could transform their life, or whether or not they could give up that addiction, or whether or not they could stay in that marriage, those hills loom or shrink based upon whether or not you think you're radically alone or you're radically with other people, which is a potential benefit to a family reunion. It's a validation of why many of you decided to come. And you realize that you're not alone. In the midst, whatever political side you're on, this has been a hard 2 years, right? And what we're finding in the midst of that is this is why mentors are so important for at-risk youth. This is why mentors are important for all of us, right? This is why in the midst of a physically distanced world, we actually had to ramp up social connection outside of the workspace so that we could actually find ways of being able to be there for our kids or to build back up with one another. In the midst of the challenges that we've been experiencing, what we found is that happiness cannot be an individual sport. Happiness is not self-help. As soon as we put it in the self-help section of Barnes & Noble, we make it 20 or 30% steeper for people to achieve. So the second study is absolutely beautiful and a metaphor for what I believe is happening here. So these researchers, there was a researcher that was going down a river in Southeast Indonesia back in the 1930s. He had never left the United States before. Patient, careful, scientific observer. They told him, whatever you do, you're studying these bugs, just make sure you're back into the boat before dark falls because you don't have any lights in the boat. He got so excited studying bugs, as one does, and he forgot to get into the boat until it got dark, and he got into the boat, and he floated right past his camp in the middle of the dark. So here he is, stuck in a jungle, on a boat, terrified he's about to get eaten by a predator, and he looks up at the mangrove tree next to him, and the mangrove tree got struck by lightning. And then, as lightning never does, the same tree got struck by lightning again, and then again, and then again, and then every single tree on one side of the river, but not the other, got struck by lightning for 100 yards. When his once, twice, and a third time, when his faculties recovered, imagine being, by the way, that scientific observer, right? In this magical moment of nature, when he looked at the trees, he realized that the lightning wasn't coming down, it was coming out from the trees. And in this beautiful moment, he realized that the trees were covered with a swarm of bioluminescent lightning bugs. But instead of lighting up individually and randomly in the dark, as they do across the globe, it turns out he claimed in the historical record that the lightning bugs, millions of them, were lighting up and going dark all at the same time. Millions of them. He went back to the United States, wrote up a scientific paper called The Miracle of the Mangroves, the case of the synchronous lightning bugs of Southeast Indonesia. And no one believed him, and he lost his job. And the reason for that is that's crazy. It's crazy because we know how the world works. It's survival of the fittest. You have to be the fastest, smartest, brightest light shining. Otherwise, you can never compete. You'll never be successful. You'll never be happy. You can never be rich. That's what we tell people. Most of that formula is completely broken. What they found 8 decades later is only in 2 places in the globe, opposite sides of the world, fireflies figured out how to do something different. Instead of lighting up individually and randomly in the dark, turns out they have these neurotransmitters so they can time their pulses to the millisecond so the entire community lights up and goes dark together, which is a terrible idea. Their success rates should plummet. But here's what happens. When you study it, what they realized was we've been so focused on the individual, we missed the interplay with what's happening in your world. And what they found is that when these researchers at MIT found that when the lightning bugs light up individually and randomly in the dark, their success rate at reproduction per night is 3%, which I'm told by entomologists, bugs doing this is really good. But it turns out that when they light together, the success rate goes from 3% to 82% per bug. It wasn't like the bug was doing really well with the new system, right? Like, keep going, guys. This is the best night of the entire system better than we thought was possible because we thought we knew how the world worked, and it's not actually survival of the fittest. It's survival of the best fit, the ecosystem around you. You see the same thing on NBA, same thing when you try to put all superstars on one team, but they underperform. We see that because Google did a study called Project Aristotle. And in Project Aristotle, they found with 100,000 employees, if you measure their individual traits and you put the superstars in the team to make superstar teams and replicate that hiring practice, turns out at the end of the study, they said, we're Google, we're amazing at finding patterns. There was no pattern in the data. There was no pattern connecting the individual traits to the success rate of the team. The only thing that was predictive of how well a team will do over the next 5-year period of time was their social cohesion score. Do you feel connected to the people you're working with? Do you know, can you use your individual traits to enhance the team? And do you have psychological safety in the midst of it? When teams did that, their success rates were so much higher than what we saw with teams with extraordinarily higher levels of individual traits, which you see all throughout sports, and we see it all throughout the business world. And at Harvard, I found that the greatest predictor of a hyper-competitive student's levels of happiness and success is their social connection score. It's the breadth, depth, and meaning in their social relationships. So what this is all an indication of is the first part is, instead of thinking, we will feel happy when, instead what we're realizing is we need to flip the formula. That happiness is the fuel to get us there. Happiness is the means, not just the end. Happiness is the precursor to success. But if we want to get there, happiness is not something we do alone. We have to find some way of enhancing the people around us, expanding power out, and defending the system together, which leads us to Tetris. So how many of you have played Tetris? The rest of you are much more productive than the rest of us. Tetris is a video game, if you don't know it, where shapes fall from the ceiling like they do in real life, and you rotate the shapes around, and the goal of Tetris is to make straight lines. Harvard Medical School paid Harvard Business School students to play Tetris for 5 hours in a row while sitting in a brain scan. At the end, they realized that they had screwed up their participants. One of the participants came up to this old professor in Harvard Yard, grabbed him, and turned around and said, I something. You're going to think I'm crazy, but after that experiment where you made me sit in the basement of that laboratory for 5 hours playing that game, I walked out of the experiment, met up with one of my friends. We walked into a supermarket, and she found me rearranging the bread on the shelves to make straight lines. She said, am I crazy? I said, yes, you are. Please stop touching me. But it turned she wasn't the only one doing this. People were dreaming about Tetris. Has anyone here dreamed about Tetris? We get about 1 out of every 700 people who have dreamed about Tetris, which is amazing. Turns out, if you view the world through the same pattern for too long, your brain retains an imprint of that pattern, even if it no longer works for you. We see that when people play Tetris for too long. We see that with the soldiers I'm working with post a combat situation, where the brain was scanning for threats, but when they come back, their brain doesn't know how to stop scanning for threats. And then the resources are absorbed there. But if we can get stuck in a negative Tetris effect, what if we get our brain stuck in a positive one? Where the very pattern through which we view the world makes us more adaptive and creates a positive ripple effect, helping us to light up together. That's what I study. There's lots of things that make people happier. Tequila, gin. No, there's lots of things. We know gardening helps, right? We know humor and music for you. Maybe it's chess for you. Maybe it's watching Game of Thrones. Maybe it's not watching Game of Thrones. Whatever it is that makes you happy. Turns out, I can't study those. Because if gardening's what makes you happy, I need to know what you're gardening with, what you've been planting, where bioclimate you're in, and then I have to get people who are in stressful situations like boot camp to go garden, and I can't do that. So here's what we look for. I'm looking for habits that are like brushing your teeth, that take less than 2 minutes a day. To tip my hand, they seem so small, we start to think they're paltry, so we just don't do them. Just like brushing our teeth. I gave a talk one time, and well, that part's not important. What we found was that we have genes for teeth that should rot out by age 15 in a high-sugar society. What it is to be human is we should have all of us should have rotted out teeth if we were our genes. But if you magically get a society to spend 45 seconds every day brushing your teeth, what it is to be human changes dramatically from your genes. The same thing is true with happiness and the way that we process the world. The problem is we all brush our teeth, we teach our kids to do it, but we default to our genes in terms of how we experience the world, in terms of happiness and success. So what I looked at, what are small things we could do, maybe even while we brushed our teeth, to transform the structures in the brain. So the first one was wrapped around gratitude. Everyone thinks that they're grateful. 98% of people think that they're highly grateful. And what we did was, in the middle of the banking crisis, I showed the leaders at American Express how when your brain is more positive, your financial decision-making improves dramatically, and then we correlated with the numbers that they had, and they could see how many millions of dollars they were leaving on the table when their people were not happy. And so what they decided was we would do an intervention. And before the markets would open every day, we had them write down 3 things that they're grateful for. And 21 days later, nothing happened. This is why we do the research. I thought that would work. That didn't work. It would be so easy for someone to come on stage and be like, gratitude's good for you, just write down 3 things you're grateful for. It doesn't work the way I thought it did because I misunderstood gratitude. 2 researchers, Emmons and McCullough, said, it doesn't matter what you're grateful for, what matters is the scanning. There's a small part of your brain that scans for things you're grateful for that never activates when I ask you what you're grateful for, and you tell me, my work, my family, and my health. That's rote. It's the same way that when we say blessings before a dinner, thank you for this food, amen, our brain is not scanning for where that salmon came from, or the truck driver who brought the corn there, or the farmer, or the weather that allowed that to happen. In the midst of that, what we find is when we do that, that part of the brain doesn't activate. What we tried to do was to activate that one portion of the brain. If we had more time, we talked about neuroplasticity. You can actually get this structure in the brain to physically grow post-adolescence, which is incredible. You could actually create a new brain. But here's what we found. For 21 days in a row, we had people write down 3 new things that they were grateful for that had occurred over the past 24 hours. That's it. The smallest change possible. So you couldn't repeat. I've done this with homeless populations. We've done this with bankers on Wall Street. What we found is 21 days later, you have 63 unique things you're grateful for. I can't say I'm grateful for my son, Leo. My brain already knows that. I have to say I'm grateful for my son, Leo, because he caught a lizard in his hands yesterday and was so proud that he did so, right? Which actually happened. So we did this. Here's what happens. If you test as a low-level pessimist on our scales, you always test as a pessimist. That's how we know our scientific metrics work. And yet, when people change 45 seconds of their day, 21 days later, those people who are testing as low-level genetic pessimists were testing, on average, as low-level optimists. That shouldn't be happening. That's one of the genetic ones. We can't touch that. You're born a pessimist, you die a pessimist, end of the story. That's not the story at all. It's half true, which makes it fully false. Because what that means is genes set the initial baseline. For some of you, happiness is much easier than it is for the rest of us, just based upon your genes. But it turns out, we can change dramatically from that by creating these small blocks of changes within our life. At NASA, I have the astronauts, while they brush their teeth, think of 3 new things that they're grateful for. We have school systems where they start the day up in Chicago, where they start the day thinking of 3 new things that they're grateful for. At American Express, what we found is if you do it for 21 days in a row, you go to low level of optimism on average. Columbia found you do it for 6 months in a row, like you keep brushing your teeth and showering, you go to low to moderate level of optimism. 4-year-old children around a dinner table predisposed towards pessimism, you do this for 6 weeks in a row where the parent models thinking of 3 new things they're grateful for out loud, and the child tries to repeat it. Turns out 6 months later, before and after school, those children are now testing as low-level optimists on average. That's life-changing. So much more powerful than that's my pessimistic kid, that's my optimistic kid. That's their genes. That's like saying, well, my kid has genes for teeth that should rot out by age 15. No, we teach them to brush their teeth. And we keep that pattern. So then we try to see what would happen if you do this in teens. Now, a lot of people think, well, that's not a part of our culture. I'm going to have to do this one on my own or when I put my kids to sleep, which is what I do. Every time when I put my now 4-year-old and my 7-year-old to sleep, we say 3 things that we're grateful for right after the prayers. So we can actually be thinking of those things. They know it's the transition out of the room, so they try and get me to stay for longer, forcing me to think of more things I'm grateful for, which is awesome. We do it, by the way, they found this if you do this with your partner or spouse at night when you're going to sleep. Turns out if you do this for 6 weeks in a row, 6 months later, not only do you rate your relationship as higher, your levels of happiness rise, your optimism score rose dramatically. We knew all that would happen. What we just found is that you actually report your spouse as being more physically attractive than they were 6 months previous, which never happens. What's amazing about this is you're viewing them with a different lens, right? And you're hearing the great things about their day that you might have missed out on. They're filling in meaning gaps for you. So anyway, we did this with a level 1 trauma hospital in Orlando, at Orlando Health. And what we did was, at every one of their meetings, in person or virtual, when they had less than 20 people for the meeting, at every single staff meeting, they would start the meeting with having every single person in the room say one thing that they're grateful for. They'd come into the meeting with one thing that they're already grateful for, right? Because they said, we're literally doing life or death decisions, right? These are stubborn doctors and people with decades of experience who have seen trauma on a daily basis, and we're asking them to do what my son does, and my 4-year-old does, or the people do in a pre-K class, thinking of things that they're grateful for. But they did it, and they said, when you come in the room, already have one thing you're grateful for. So they could get to everyone in the room in less than 2 minutes. This is an amazing way for us to create a culture that's positive. They did it for 2 weeks. They did it for 2 months. Then if the leader tried to start the meeting, right, going for the fires, felt like something was wrong. They had changed the social script, just like we saw at the hospital system at Ochsner with the smiling experiment earlier. They did it for 2 years. And 2 years, almost to the day we started it, the Pulse nightclub shooting occurred 3 streets away from them. The second largest mass shooting in US history. And all the victims came to the hospital that had been using gratitude at every single staff meeting before coming in, before starting their work. The next morning, after the worst trauma they had experienced as a community, they started their meetings with gratitude, and they said it was universal. They said everyone there was so grateful they hadn't wasted the last 2 years just working with the people they work with. That's the culture we want, where we front load optimism. But it turns out when we study it, gratitude is the glue that makes us more resilient and raises our levels of happiness and our success rates. So what we started looking at are there other ones? The antidepressant companies, pre-pandemic, found that if you go on a brisk walk, which many people started adopting in the middle of the pandemic because it's something they felt like they could do, if you go on a brisk walk, and it's magnified if you do it with one other person, if you go on a brisk walk for 4 to 5 times a week for 15 minutes and do it for 6 months, at the 6-month mark, your depression rates drop equal to the strongest tier of antidepressants we have for the first 6 months. For the next 2 years, you have a 30% lower relapse rate. Now remember, this is the antidepressant companies that are studying this. This is not a repudiation of antidepressants, which many people are on. Not at all. What this was an indication of was something beautiful, why our behavior actually matters as well. It turns out that when you created a behavioral step and did it with somebody, and you saw that it had a feedback loop making you more positive, your brain starts to create entire constellations of positive habits in your life. And that exercise was one of the greatest antidepressants we had in the modern world. Then we found out we had people at Google take their hands off of their keyboard for 2 minutes a day and just watch their breath go in and out. When they finish, they feel like they're 2 minutes behind the rest of the day. But we're getting them to do multitasking down to single tasking, just watching your breath go in and out for 2 minutes. And they feel like nothing happens. But 21 days later, if they've done it for 21 days in a row, their levels of happiness rise, their success levels, their accuracy rates improve by 10%, and the stress levels of people on their team drop, even if those people were not meditating. So what you see is that 2 minutes you did alone in your hotel room had an impact upon the people that you work with or that you met at a family reunion. Then we found out that if you journal about a positive experience each day, think about one meaningful thing that happened over the past 24 hours, you're going to have a lot of meaningful things while you're here. Just one. And in your phone, on a Word document, if you're fancy in a moleskin, you just write down every detail you can remember in 2 minutes about that one experience. Your brain can't tell the difference between visualization and actual experience. So you literally just doubled the most meaningful experience over the past 24 hours. You do it for 21 days in a row, your brain connects the dots for you. You now have a trajectory of meaning running throughout your life. Fastest intervention we found of raising people's levels of engagement in the midst of a world in which they feel like that they're powerless. in the midst of depression, it reminds us that there is meaning involved with our relationships and with our life. And we did this with people with chronic neuromuscular disease, and we got people, chronic neuromuscular disease, and we did this for 6 months, and at the 6-month mark, it turns out they were able to drop their pain medication on average by 50%. These are stunning, well-researched applications that we are not doing in our lives. How many people journal for 2 minutes a day about a positive experience? It's a handful, but how many people brush your teeth? It's all of us, right? So gratitude, journaling, exercise, where I'd like to leave you with in terms of a habit is the most powerful. And I would love to see you do this. Because there's so many people that are here, but it allows for impact for all the people that were lucky enough to not get to join the family reunion. So what we did at LinkedIn initially, and we've done it worldwide, is we got people for 2 minutes every day, 2 minutes for 21 days in a row, we got them to write a 2-minute positive email praising or thanking someone in their life. We then did it with text messages, and for some reason the text messages work better. We don't know why, maybe because it keeps it short, so people keep doing it. A 2-minute text message or email praising or thanking one person in their life. That's literally the softest takeaway you'll ever hear at a talk. Any of the skeptics in the room are like, yep, he talked about unicorns, and now he wants us to write a positive note. That's exactly what I thought would happen. But when we study the small, we start to realize how much our behavior matters. This is one I hope you'll do as soon as we leave here. Think about somebody right now that you could write to that needs a text message. Write them a 2-minute text message praising or thanking them for one meaningful thing. If you do it, it'll be the best part of my talk. If you do it for 3 days, for the next 3 days, challenging yourself to do it, you will get addicted to it. You will spend all day long thinking about how amazing you were for writing that email in the morning. You're like, I'm the kind of person who does this stuff. And you get great emails back because they don't know about that 2-minute maximum rule, so they keep writing about how great they think you are, and you're like, tell me more. But 21 days later, actually, I was going to say 21 days later is the real value, but day 8 is the real value. I love doing this, actually, in talks. We're right up at our time here, so I won't have you do this right now. But sometimes I'll have people do this in the conference, and they'll write the 2-minute text message, and then invariably they'll forget to have their phone silenced. You'll hear ding, 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 ding around the room, and it's people writing back being like, you have no idea how much I need to hear this, right? Or you've never said anything like this before to me. Or it's 11 a.m., are you drunk? But here's what we found. If you do this for day 8, everyone runs out of people. Everyone says, I don't have 21 people to write to. I'm not one of those crazy extroverts that has all these people to write to. And then they stop. Day 8 is the transition. Then you have to scan. And you scan for people that aren't in your visible social support network. You're looking for the hidden ecosystem. You remember that mentor who got you into this. That person who touched your life. Your kid's first grade teacher that transformed your kid, but you haven't talked to them in 2 years because your kid's in 3rd grade. That coach. Those friends from where you used to live. Remember them? Or from college, right? Or from high school. That friend that moved away, that friend who has breast cancer right now, that friend that you haven't seen since the pandemic. I wrote to a high school English teacher from Midway High School in Waco, and I told her, you were the reason I fell in love with writing. You're the reason I wrote a book later in my life. Thank you for changing my life. It took me 45 seconds to type. It took me longer to find that woman's email address online. Turns out, when I looked at my people, it was basically your favorites and a few people at work. But when you scan, you realize there are all these people who have meant so much to you, and when you scan for them, they faintly light up on your mental map. But when you write to them, something powerful happens. In the midst of the pandemic, they found that that loneliness is not the absence of people, it's the absence of feeling like you have a meaningful impact upon them or they upon you. Changed in a 2-minute use of technology. But here's what happens. When you do that, they light up. And if you do this for the next 21 days in a row, you're a rarity. It's less than 10% when we don't pay you to do this experiment, right? When we pay you, people do it. But when you just have to do it on your own, it's less than 10%. But if you're one of those weirdos or outliers who does this for the next 21 days in a row, if you're starting in a socially isolated position, your social connection score rises to the top 15% of people worldwide. I wanted to conclude with that because social connection is the greatest predictor of your happiness, and it's impacted by a 2-minute positive habit. Social connection is as predictive of how long you will end up living as obesity, high blood pressure, or smoking. We fight so hard against the negative. We forget to tell people how powerful the positive can be. We can extend your life as much by getting you to stop smoking as getting you to write 2-minute positive emails. But if you deepen your social bonds, your likelihood of stopping an addiction rises dramatically because you have social connection. What we found is that this research, when you start to put it together, has huge implications within our life. At LinkedIn, we found if someone received 3 touch points of praise, their retention rates went from 80% to 94%. When they receive 3 touch points of praise, they double the amount of praise that they give back out. They become praise multipliers. And what we found when we did this is that these ideas, when we started putting them together, had huge implications. What I want to conclude with is a few years ago, I got the opportunity to go, I got invited to join a show called Super Soul Sunday by Oprah. And she invited me, it's one of my favorite shows, they invited me out to her house out in Montecito, California. I had never met a celebrity at this point. I thought I'd be cool. I wasn't at all. They make you wait up at the top. She has instead of a green room, she has a green house for you, and you just wait there and you change clothes multiple times, and then they have people running you back and forth, and you get into a golf cart and you go down through a redwood forest that she has on her property, as one does, and you go through it, and then you get out, and they have 3 camera crews filming this beautiful and organic first meeting with Oprah. And I saw her, and my brain just turned off. It was like, nope, I'm out. And she was like, Sean. And I didn't know the protocol, like, Oprah. So I said nothing. I just stared at her, and her hands were up. So I thought we were doing a high five. And our hands interdigitated, and we started rotating in a circle with my panic eyes staring at all the way around, and they had to shut off the cameras. They said the first time ever in that show. If you ever see that interview with her where I see her for the first time, that's the second time. But a few minutes later, she makes you feel so comfortable you'll tell her anything, which is why the next part happened. They were breaking down the cameras, and I turned to her and said, Oprah, I'm so disappointed with this interview. And she said, why? And she said, I'm so disappointed because we didn't get to talk about depression. And it's so easy to hear all the things I talked about in that interview, or all the things I talked about here today, and for someone to think, yeah, of course he's happy. He's a happiness researcher. His wife's a happiness researcher. His sister's a unicorn. And of course, Oprah's happy. Take your life and then just add in all of her successes and wealth, right? Of course she's happy. She's got a private jet. She said, Sean, I went through 2 years of depression at the height of my career when I was making the most money. And I just shattered. I told her I went through 2 years of depression while I was living in those first-year dorms, and my job was to make sure that the first-year students didn't go through depression. And then I went through 2 years of it. I tried to put up a front to be there for other people constantly, and I didn't let them in. And as a result of that, I went deeper and deeper in depression, trying to do it alone. The turning point was I started to do these positive habits, but I also opened up to my 8 closest friends and family about what I was struggling with. I said I was going through depression for more than 2 years. I don't know if I can get out of this. I have genes for family history of depression, but I just needed to tell somebody. The groundswell of support was amazing. People were calling me, meeting up with me, emailing me, bringing me cupcakes, which is not why I did it, but they were great. These are people that were kind of my competitors there at Harvard, that suddenly they started opening up about things that they were dealing with. And what happened is that hill of overcoming that challenge, depression, in front of me dropped by 30%. Because I'm not climbing it alone, I'm climbing it with other people. So what we started to realize was that if we take this research and find a way of doing it not alone, but doing it with other people and talking about it and sharing it and talking about the successes with it, what we find is it changes who we are. And what I remember being that Harvard student, lying on a floor in a bathroom, so depressed, breathing hurt, I had no idea that someday I would be studying happiness, much less that anything like today would ever happen. So from that kid, years later, I just want to say thank you for inviting me to your family reunion, but also how much the story can change if we take this research that's only read on average by 7 people total and bring it to life. And when we do so, we light up together in the dark and we change the world for people 2, 3, 4 degrees separate as we become stronger, better together and move forward together. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here with you. I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you.
So, are we still recording? We're gonna stop it. I just thought that was amazing. That's why I want to share it with everybody, and hopefully
Appreciate you did.
the whole thing